October 14th, 1926, 11:47 p.m. Frank Nitti's hand trembled slightly as he tightened his grip on the checkered wood of the revolver. $50,000. That was the bounty the North Side gang had placed on Al Capone's head. And Nitti, Al's trusted associate for years, the man Capone called his own brother, had accepted the contract. The scheme was straightforward. Enter the Hawthorne Inn. Wait for Snorky to be preoccupied. A single round to the base of the skull. Vanish into the thick Chicago night. Frank stepped inside. Capone was seated at his usual table, back turned, completely exposed. Nitti drew his piece, took aim, and squeezed the trigger. Click. A hollow sound. Nothing. The lounge fell deathly quiet. Capone turned his chair around with agonizing slowness, stared Nitti straight in the eyes, and uttered 5 words that would define an era. I've been counting on you. What the public never realized, what the history books will never record, is that Al Capone had been aware of the plot for 3 weeks, and his actions during those 21 days didn't merely preserve his life, they rewrote the laws of power in Chicago forever. To grasp the events of that night at the Hawthorne, one must understand who Al Capone was in 1926. He wasn't simply another hoodlum clawing his way up from the gutters of Brooklyn or the alleyways of Chicago. By that year, Capone had become something far more dangerous than a common gangster. He was an institution, a system, a living network of favors, debts, loyalties, and quiet threats that stretched from the back rooms of Cicero saloons to the polished offices of City Hall. Chicago in the mid-20s was not a city, it was a battlefield wearing a suit. Prohibition had turned liquor into liquid gold, and the men who controlled its flow controlled everything else. Judges drank it, cops protected it, politicians campaigned on money soaked in it. And at the center of that river of bootleg whiskey stood Capone, each directing traffic with a smile and a cigar. The North Side gang hated him for that very reason. Bugs Moran and his people had tried for years to crack Capone's grip on the city. They ambushed his trucks. They torched his warehouses. They sent gunmen to riddle his lieutenants with lead in broad daylight. Every move they made cost them men, and every loss only strengthened Capone's legend. Because Capone didn't just retaliate, he responded. When families in Cicero couldn't pay rent during the winter months, envelopes appeared under their doors. When small business owners were harassed by police looking for bribes, the harassment mysteriously stopped. When rival crews tried to muscle into Capone territory, they didn't just get chased out, they were made examples of. Ambulances carried broken bodies back across invisible border lines. By 1926, the old rules no longer applied. This wasn't about territory anymore, it was about survival, and the North Side gang knew, something had to change. That's why Bugs Moran called the meeting. The back room was dim, the air thick with cigar smoke and resentment. Representatives from every rival faction sat around the scarred wooden table, nursing drinks and old grudges. We've tried everything, Moran said, his voice flat, tired. Gunmen, bribes, politics, nothing sticks. Every time we think we've got him cornered, he's already gone. Jaime Weiss leaned back, exhaling smoke slowly. Then maybe we're playing the wrong game. Moran's eyes narrowed. What do you mean? We stopped trying to hit the king, Weiss said. We hit the board. That's when someone said the name. Nitti McGurn. The room went quiet. Nitti wasn't just muscle. He was family. A man who had stood next to Capone through police raids, gang wars, and funerals. A man who had taken bullets meant for someone else. A man who knew Capone's habits, his routines, his blind spots. If Capone could be touched at all, it would be by Nitti. The decision was made without a vote. Tony the Fixer was sent to do what he did best. On a humid August evening, as Nitti stepped out of his Michigan Avenue apartment, a black Packard slid up to the curb, like it belonged there. The window rolled down slowly. Tony smiled. He spoke calmly, casually, like a man discussing the weather. "You've got 5 minutes," Tony said, "and 50,000 reasons to listen." Curiosity is poison to men like Nitti. And poison works slowly. Inside the car, Tony didn't threaten him. He didn't insult him. He simply spoke the truth. The kind of truth men like Nitti never said out loud. Loyalty didn't cure tuberculosis. Money did. When Tony opened the briefcase, Nitti didn't touch the cash. He didn't need to. He could already feel its weight pressing against his chest. By the time Nitti stepped out of the car, the briefcase was still inside, but the offer was inside him. That night, as the elevated trains rattled past his windows and his daughter coughed herself into exhausted sleep, Nitti stared at the ceiling and did the math. Loyalty versus blood. Honor versus survival. 3 days later, he made the call. What Nitti didn't know, what Tony didn't know, was that the moment that Packard had stopped at the curb, someone else had been watching, and that someone had already started counting down the days, and that someone was Al Capone. Capone didn't learn about threats the way most men did, through whispers passed too late or gunshots fired too close. He learned about them early, quietly, through people no one noticed. The men who opened doors, the boys who carried bags, the women who wiped down tables after the music stopped. The city spoke to Capone because he listened when everyone else talked over it. The valet, Giuseppe, had been one of those invisible men. He wasn't clever, he wasn't ambitious, but he was observant, and in Chicago that was often more dangerous than being smart. He'd seen the Packard idle too long outside Nitti's building. He'd seen Nitti step inside and return minutes later with a look on his face Giuseppe had seen before, on men leaving doctors' offices, on men walking out of police stations, on men who'd just been handed news that couldn't be undone. Giuseppe wrote the license plate down on a cigarette pack not because he knew what it meant, but because instinct told him it might. 2 hours later, he was standing in Capone's private office at the Metropole. Capone didn't interrupt him, didn't rush him. He listened the way a priest listens to confession, eyes steady, cigar burning slow. When Giuseppe finished, Capone nodded once and slid $500 across the desk. "You didn't see a thing," Capone said calmly. Giuseppe nodded and left, his hands shaking, not from fear, but from the strange understanding that he had just stepped close to something massive and survived. Capone stayed seated long after the door closed. Nitti McGurn. The name carried weight. Nitti wasn't just another soldier. He was blood-earned loyalty, a man Capone had trusted with his back turned, a man who had shared meals at his table, laughed at his jokes, stood guard while Capone slept. And now the North Side boys were whispering into his ear. Capone exhaled smoke slowly and considered his options. The simple solution was obvious. Clean, efficient. One call, one ride, one body disappearing into black water. That was how the old bosses handled betrayal, cut it out before it spread. But Capone had never survived by doing what was simple. He had survived by doing what was memorable. Over the next 3 weeks, Capone watched Nitti carefully, but never obviously. No confrontations, no accusations, just observation. He noticed the way Nitti drank a little more than usual, the way his jokes fell flat, the way his eyes avoided Capone's just a fraction longer than necessary. Guilt left fingerprints, if you knew where to look. Capone learned about the sick daughter without asking, learned about the hospital bills, learned about the late-night pacing, the unpaid tabs, the silent prayers men like Nitti never admitted to saying. And that was when Capone decided he wouldn't kill Nitti. He would let Nitti try. The call to Victor, the gunsmith in Cicero, was brief. "I need a favor," Capone said. "Something special." Victor had been modifying weapons for Capone long enough to know not to ask why. When Capone explained, Victor frowned. "You're asking for a gun that betrays its owner." Capone smiled thinly. "No, I'm asking for a gun that tells the truth." The weapon Victor delivered 3 days later was perfect, balanced, weighted, identical in every way that mattered. It could pass inspection by a man who'd cleaned firearms his whole life, except it was dead. Capone held it, tested it, nodded once. Good work. The switch had to be flawless. On September 8th, Capone sent Nitti across town on an errand that didn't exist. Important, urgent, just far enough away. Capone entered Nitti's apartment with Tomas, moving like men who had done this before. They found the revolver where Capone knew it would be. They replaced it, left no trace. When Nitti returned home that night, he checked his piece out of habit. It felt right. That was the most dangerous part. From that moment on, Capone did nothing. He let time do the work. He let the pressure build. Let the North Side boys wait. Let Nitti convince himself that the plan would work, because the power of what Capone was about to do depended on witnesses, on timing, on the click. September 12th arrived heavy and hot. The Metropole was packed. Music, laughter, sweat, money, everything Chicago lived for, compressed into one room. Capone took his usual seat, relaxed, exposed, and somewhere near the bar, Nitti McGurn waited with a dead gun and a living mistake. The clock edged closer. 11:47, the second hand crawled. 11:46 bled into 11:47 without ceremony, just another second slipping into history. The jazz band was halfway through a fast number, brass flaring, drums snapping like gunfire that hadn't happened yet. The room pulsed with movement. Servers weaving between tables, glasses clinking, laughter bursting and dying just as fast. Capone leaned back in his chair, seemingly at ease. Anyone watching him closely would have seen the performance for what it was. The relaxed shoulders, the unhurried sip of rye, the way his eyes never stopped moving. He knew where everyone was. He knew where Nitti was, too. Nitti stood near the bar, fingers curled around the edge of the counter hard enough to whiten his knuckles. Sweat beaded at his hairline, trickling down his neck beneath the collar of his coat. The room felt smaller than it should have, louder, hotter. This was the moment. 3 weeks of waiting collapsed into a single breath. Nitti reached into his coat pocket and wrapped his hand around the revolver. The steel was cool, familiar, comforting in the way old habits always are. He reminded himself that this was mercy, that one clean shot was better than the slow rot of hospitals and unpaid debts. He told himself Capone would never feel it. He stepped away from the bar. No one stopped him. Why would they? Nitti McGurn walked behind Capone 100 times a night. His presence was as ordinary as the smoke curling toward the ceiling. 2 steps. 4. 6. The bartender noticed first. He saw the motion, the angle of Nitti's arm, the flash of steel. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Instinct screamed at him to shout, to dive, to do something. But instinct came too late. Nitti raised the gun. Time fractured. The band hit a high note. Capone lifted his glass. Nitti squeezed the trigger. Click. The sound was wrong. It wasn't sharp. It wasn't final. It was empty. A hollow, useless noise that echoed far louder than a gunshot ever could. Silence slammed into the room. The music died mid-note, brass gasping into nothing. Conversations froze. Laughter snapped off like a switch had been thrown. 300 people turned toward the sound as one. Nitti stared at the revolver, pulled the trigger again. Click. Capone did not move. He didn't flinch, didn't duck, didn't turn in panic. He took a slow sip of rye, set the glass down gently, and only then began to rotate his chair. The scrape of wood against floor sounded thunderous. Capone faced Nitti. Their eyes met. In that moment, Nitti understood everything. Not just the gun, not just the setup. Everything, the timing, the errand, the money, the silence. Capone hadn't missed a thing. "I've been counting on you, Nitti." The words landed softly, almost kindly. That was worse. The revolver slipped from Nitti's hand and clattered onto the floor. His knees buckled. He dropped hard, the impact echoing through the room. Someone gasped. Someone else swore under their breath. Capone stood. The room felt smaller with him on his feet. "I know about your daughter," Capone said, his voice low but steady. "I knew before they ever spoke to you." Nitti's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Tears burned his eyes. His chest hitched as years of fear and justification collapsed at once. "I was desperate," he whispered. "I didn't know." "I know," Capone said again, cutting him off gently. Too gently. "That's why this hurts." He reached into his pocket and placed a thick envelope on the table. It landed with a dull, final sound. "Her bills are paid. Every one of them, this morning." Nitti stared at the envelope like it might explode. Capone leaned closer. "But now everyone knows who you are." The words sliced deeper than any blade. Capone straightened and looked around the room. Faces stared back then police reports, faster even than the trains rolling out of Union Station. It traveled mouth to mouth, bar to bar, whispered over breakfast tables, and hissed through backroom meetings. Al Capone had let a man try to kill him, and lived. Not just lived, controlled it, bent it, turned betrayal into theater and power into law. On the South Side, the story was told with reverence, with pride. Capone had shown restraint where others would have shown blood, mercy where others would have shown fear. It wasn't weakness. Everyone understood that. It was something worse for his enemies. It was proof. On the North Side, the mood was very different. The emergency meeting was called before noon in a quiet social club that pretended to be nothing more than a place for cards and conversation. Bugs Moran arrived late, already angry, already pacing. "They made us look like fools," Moran snapped, slamming his palm against the table. 3 weeks. He knew for 3 damn weeks. No one spoke at first. Then Paul Ricca leaned forward. "This wasn't luck," Ricca said calmly. "This was design." Moran scoffed. "So what? We keep trying." Ricca shook his head slowly. "No, we stop." That got their attention. "You don't stop a man like that by force," Ricca continued. "You don't buy his people. You don't scare him. Every move we make teaches him something, and every lesson makes him stronger." Moran glared at him. "So we just give up Chicago?" Ricca met his eyes. "We stop bleeding for it." Silence settled over the room. It was the first retreat no one would ever publicly admit to, but everyone would remember. Back on the south side, Capone returned to his routines as if nothing had happened. That was perhaps the most unsettling part of it all. No victory parade, no crackdown, no purge, just business. He finished his whiskey that night, paid the band extra, went home. But the lesson lingered. Men who had been thinking about making deals thought twice. Men who had been listening to outside whispers suddenly remembered where their bread came from. Loyalty, once an abstract idea, became very real and very expensive to betray. As for Nitti McGurn, he left Chicago before dawn. No escort, no send-off. Just a man, his family, and the weight of a moment he would never outrun. He would spend the rest of his life somewhere else, doing honest work, carrying the knowledge that he had stood inches from killing a king and failed. Years later, when men spoke about power, they didn't talk about guns. They talked about that clique. They talked about how Capone had turned silence into a weapon. They talked about how Chicago had learned, without a single shot fired, who truly ruled it. And Capone? He went back to his corner table. Because kings don't need to move. They let the board come to them. Time, however, has a way of sanding legends down to their edges. As the years passed, the details blurred, but the core never did. Men argued over dates, over rooms, over which band had been playing that night. Some swore it was the Metropole, others insisted it was the Hawthorne. The arguments didn't matter. What mattered was that everyone agreed on one thing. Capone had known. The North Side never tried again, not like that, not directly. Their ambition didn't die, but it learned to bend. They focused outward, toward the suburbs, toward quieter routes and smaller profits. Chicago's heart remained untouched, beating steadily under Capone's thumb. And Capone himself changed after that night. Not visibly, not in the ways most people would notice. But something inside him hardened. He trusted fewer smiles, counted favors more carefully. Loyalty, once assumed, was now tested in subtler ways. He rewarded faithfulness generously. He punished betrayal surgically, never sloppy, never emotional. That restraint became his true signature. When younger men asked him how he'd survived when so many others hadn't, Capone never mentioned guns or money. He talked about patience, about listening, about knowing when to wait. "Everybody wants to be loud," he once said. "The trick is knowing when to be quiet." The click echoed in his memory, long after the room had filled with music again. It reminded him that even kings were mortal, but only if they forgot to think. The federal pressure would come later. The indictments, the trials, the slow tightening of the net. That was a different war, fought with paperwork instead of bullets. But on the streets, among the men who mattered, the verdict had already been delivered. Al Capone was not to be rushed, not to be bought, not to be surprised. And the man who had almost proven otherwise became a ghost, spoken of rarely, pitied quietly, remembered only as a cautionary tale. A name whispered when someone got too greedy, a shadow behind every bad decision. Because Chicago had learned something that night that never appeared in any court transcript or history book. The most dangerous man in the room isn't the one holding the gun. It's the one who already knows it won't fire. History would later try to compress that night into a paragraph, a footnote, a rumor, an anecdote traded between scholars who never smelled the smoke or felt the pause stretch long enough to choke a room. But history was never good at capturing tension. What it couldn't record was the way men slept differently afterward, how conversations lowered in volume when Capone's name surfaced, how deals were reconsidered not because of fear alone, but because of certainty. Fear fades. Certainty stays. Capone had removed uncertainty from Chicago. Before that night, there had always been a question hanging in the air. What if? What if someone got close enough? What if loyalty cracked? What if the king slipped? Afterward, there were no more questions, only outcomes. Capone continued expanding, not recklessly, but methodically. Cicero remained solid. The South Side thrived. Supply lines tightened. Distribution smoothed. Money flowed with fewer interruptions. Violence, ironically, decreased. Nobody wanted to test a man who didn't need to raise his voice to win. Police reports noted the shift without understanding it. Less chaos, fewer public shootings, more order among criminals than among cops. The city breathed differently. Capone himself aged into the role. He stopped chasing reputation and began cultivating inevitability. When he entered a room, people adjusted without being told. Chairs shifted. Deals concluded faster. Lies shortened themselves. He listened more than he spoke. And when he did speak, men remembered. Every once in a while someone new, young, ambitious, reckless, would ask about the story, about the night someone tried to kill him. Capone never corrected the details. He let them exaggerate. Let them argue. Let the myth grow teeth, because myths protect better than guards. Years later, when the federal government finally found a way to cage him, not with bullets, but with numbers and ledgers, the streets barely reacted. His power there had already done its work. Chicago didn't need Capone anymore. It had absorbed him. The lesson remained embedded in the city's bones, passed down quietly among men who understood what power really was. Not force, not money, but timing and patience, and knowing exactly when to let your enemy pull the trigger. By the time the papers caught up, the truth was already outpaced by interpretation. Columnists speculated, detectives postured, moral crusaders wagged fingers and promised that men like Capone would meet their end soon enough. None of them understood what had really happened because none of them had been in that room when the music stopped. The underworld understood. They understood that violence had rules now, unspoken, ironclad rules written, not in blood but in memory. A man could be killed. A man could be replaced. But a demonstration like that lingered. Capone never spoke publicly about the attempt. Not once. He didn't need to. Every silence on the matter only deepened its gravity. When reporters asked indirect questions, he smiled and redirected. When police hinted at internal fractures, he laughed. Inside the outfit, however, the message was unmistakable. Information mattered more than muscle. Trust was conditional, and mercy, when offered, was never free. The Hawthorne, whether it was remembered by that name or another, became a quiet landmark. Not a shrine, not a warning sign, just a place where something irreversible had happened. Men drank there differently afterward, laughed differently, looked over shoulders they never used to check, because they remembered the click. Capone's inner circle changed, too. Fewer men, tighter access. Thomas remained close. A handful of others rotated in and out, tested over time rather than promoted quickly. Loyalty was no longer declared, it was proven. Capone aged into patience the way other men aged into bitterness. He began thinking in longer arcs, years instead of weeks. consequences instead of reactions. The city became a machine in his mind, and he learned exactly where to apply pressure and where to leave things untouched. And always, in the background, was that single sound, a failed ending, a beginning disguised as nothing. The men who survived that era carried the lesson with them long after Capone himself was gone. They told it to sons and nephews, to protégés who thought ambition alone was enough. They told them about a night when the most powerful man in Chicago sat still and let fate reveal itself, and how by doing nothing, he had done everything. Decades later, when Capone's name had been reduced to headlines, caricatures, and cautionary tales told in classrooms, the men who had lived through it knew better. They knew that power didn't peak with gunfire or end in prison cells. It crystallized in moments like that one. The night didn't change Chicago overnight. It didn't end the wars or clean the streets. What it did was subtler and far more permanent. It shifted how men thought, smart, how they calculated risk, how they weighed loyalty against opportunity. Before, betrayal had been a gamble. Afterward, it was a certainty, with consequences already written. Capone's rivals learned to read him the way sailors read weather, not by obvious signs, but by pressure, by stillness, by the absence of noise. When Capone was quiet, they worried. When he smiled, they waited. When he did nothing, they backed away. The outfit thrived on that understanding. And Capone himself? He carried on as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. Same routines, same table, same whiskey poured at the same angle into the same glass. He understood that true dominance didn't announce itself. It settled in. Men came and went. Faces changed. Names faded. But the structure held. Even when the federal government finally closed in, even when accountants and prosecutors succeeded where gunmen had failed, Capone's street legacy remained intact. Prison could confine a body. It couldn't undo a lesson already learned. Chicago remembered. It remembered the silence after the click. It remembered the way a king didn't reach for a weapon. And it remembered that the most devastating move in any game is letting your opponent believe they've already won. Because by the time they realize the truth, it's far too late. In the end, that was the real legacy of the night. Not the failed assassination, not the traitor brought low, not even the mercy that spared a life. It was the lesson burned into the bones of the city. That power was not noise. That control did not require chaos. That the man who truly ruled never needed to rush, never needed to shout, never needed to fire first. Chicago carried that lesson forward, long after the smoke cleared and the music faded, long after the speakeasies closed and the headlines moved on. It lived on in the pauses before decisions, in the careful glances exchanged across tables, in the silence that followed reckless ambition. Al Capone lived for many years after that night. He died in 1947, not from a bullet, but from a heart attack. Ironically, he passed away in a quiet room, far from the same South Side speakeasies where he'd faced down Big Jim. But here's the thing. Al proved something that night that most people miss. The most dangerous weapon isn't a Tommy gun. It's knowing what's coming before your enemy does. It's turning their plan into your victory. It's playing chess while they're still learning checkers. Big Jim took $50,000 from the outfit. He left Chicago with nothing but shame. And Snorky, he went back to his corner table, finished his whiskey, and kept being the king of the South Side. Look, if this story got you hyped, do me a favor, hit that like button real quick. And if you're not subscribed yet, What are you waiting for? We're dropping these Al Capone stories every day, and believe me, the next one is even more wild. Leave a comment and let me know. Could Snorky have handled this differently? Would you have let Big Jim walk out alive? And hey, keep your eyes peeled, because next week we're telling the story of how Al Capone walked into Johnny Torrio's office unarmed and walked out with the deal of the century. You don't want to miss that. Remember, in Chicago, respect wasn't given, it was earned. And Al Capone earned his every single day.